Episode 12 of the Beth Zemsky Podcast. Interact. Interconnect. You're connected to the Beth Zemsky Podcast. Hello and welcome to the Beth Zemsky Podcast. I'm Ryan Garza from NonPod, the nonprofit podcast community. Here with Beth Zemsky and friend Beth. How you doing? It's been a minute.
I'm good. I've been really busy, so I'm a bit stressed out tonight, but really happy to be here back at the Riverview Cafe with some wine, some good nibbles, and some good friends.
You got to do that every now and then, right?
Right, because otherwise you're just spinning my own head, and it's just not a pretty place to be.
Yeah, little self-care is never a bad thing. So you did mention, do you have a friend with you today? Would you like to introduce our special guest, please?
Yeah, so I'm thrilled to be here with Rox Anderson. And we were just talking about how we know each other. It's been somewhere between 20 and 24 years. Is that right?
That's right. That's correct.
So how did we first meet?
I think we met officially, had a conversation for the first time at Cregan's Resort back in the day when Outfront Minnesota had their annual kind of retreat conference there.
Yeah. And I was doing some sort of keynote. We were at the pool, but you swear we were not in the hot tub, which is usually where I have most good conversations.
Yeah, I know that we weren't in the hot tub because we were sitting at one of the little tables. And the reason I'm very sure we weren't at the hot tub is because when you got up and left the table, I had to ask the table who you were because your yams, the legs were just popping. And I think you were cycling a lot then.
Right. It was around the time when I was doing the AIDS rides.
Yeah. Yes.
So I had quads to die for.
Yeah, totally.
I still have quads to die for.
Yeah.
I like to think anyway.
I'm guessing you do.
So Rox, we wanted to give you a chance to kind of introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about your background, some of the work you've done, and kind of maybe where you've worked with Beth over the years.
All right, Rox Anderson, and currently I'm the director at the Minnesota Transgender Health Coalition, and I've been with MTHC for more than 10 years, and I started like all good nonprofit folks as a volunteer. And the other things that I do in community are mostly around art and leadership and healing. So I started and currently direct the Rare Productions, which is an art and entertainment production for LGBT folks of color.
And we were talking about maybe where your guys' work intersects. And Beth, you kind of had some thoughts about that.
Well, I was actually trying to think about it because I often think of us more being in community with each other than actually working together. But we've done a lot of that, in community, right? So, go ahead.
Yeah, for sure. I feel work is the lesbian health fair that we helped put on. That was a work thing. But I think also a community partner, comrade,
Co-conspirator, I think was.
Co-conspirator. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. And there have been times when I've sort of been in that sort of official facilitator role, but it's often been not around money, but being in community, facilitating some of the strategic planning for Minnesota Trans Health Coalition, right? Or facilitating youth meetings or planning meetings for Reclaim at Minnesota Trans Health Coalition or, the exchange space or something like that.
Yeah. Even as far back as District 202, being really instrumental in, connecting young people with then, your kind of topic phrase or your kind of work was really centering kind of around the movement moments and what those waves were about. And so I remember one of those times you coming in and kind of leading that session with young people.
Yeah, I forgot all about that, being at District and sort of getting them all jazzed about being part of a movement, right? Rather than just being at District, that they were sort of involved in this trajectory of history of movement.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the places where we kind of intersect quite often is creating opportunities for people to gain resources to do other stuff around their own leadership and movement building. I think when when Beth really first started her consulting business, for me that was kind of like an aha moment of here's a way in which folks can kind of take their expertise and share it in community in a way that's meaningful. And so I think kind of that platform of we can do this work as we explore culture and learn about competencies and learn how vast and how different and how very similar kind of the different niches in the queer community and just like Minnesota, we're very different in lots of aspects, but there's also, to use Beth's terminology, there's also like the movement waves in which different connector pieces, different cultural groups can build together against kind of, inequity.
Yeah, and Beth, I've heard from a few people at this point now that your work has inspired or influenced their work in similar ways. I mean, have you heard this from other people too?
Yeah, and it's always surprises me, right? Because I have sort of a self-image of just being somebody who like thinks about stuff and then shares it with folks and wants to hear what they think about stuff, and so it always surprises me about the impact. Right. So we were at Creating Change recently, and you were saying something about a young person you were with having that like, oh, that's Beth Zemsky, which like completely like is not my image of myself. Right. And so, I think part of that, frankly, is I just do what I do. But I also have been really thinking about that since Creating Change when you said that, like what part of that is like the internalized misogyny about like us not taking ourselves seriously?
You actually said that in your first, it was like our second episode, right? When you were surprised that people were interested in what you had to say, and you were saying there was a lot of that internalized stuff sometimes, right?
You are. I'm recycling it, right? Because it happens to me all the time, and then I really have to think about what is it about folks who live on the intersection of various oppressions that we don't really necessarily think about the contribution we're making to the world, and really like push it. Like I was listening to a podcast this afternoon, Krista Tippett or whatever, and this guy on the podcast was really talking about how one of the most important problems in Western culture right now is overconfidence. And what he was talking about, I think, was white guy overconfidence, right? Yeah. And about, folks thinking they're all that when those of us who are to sometimes like Rox, who's been this amazing rock star, Rox the rock star, we don't...
Rockstar DJ, actually.
Right. But we don't necessarily put ourselves out there in that way. And, there is this thing about being in community, and so we're all in this together, right? But there's also this way that we're not seizing the expertise, And so when I did start a consulting practice, it was like stepping off a cliff, not just in terms of money and stuff like that, but it was really like, people are really going to pay me to hear what I have to say? And that was like a bizarre concept. It still is.
Have you experienced that in the work that you've done, maybe working with people, that sort of an internalized dialogue as well?
Yeah, for sure. And I think if you're connected or part of any kind of marginalized community, that that kind of insult that you get from larger society that says you're not valuable in all these different ways, adds to that. And then I think there's this other thing about, trying to keep your ego in check, so you don't want to be big-headed, and I think that when you're invested in doing the work, in growing community, and helping other folks, reach the resources that you need, the ego part has to stay in check, because it's not about you at that point. It's really about, you're maybe using the information that you have to really help, or not help is not the right word, create a mechanism for somebody else to reach their full potential.
And another thing that you guys have in common, actually, is that you've both been Grand Marshals of Twin Cities Pride. And another thing you have in common, you guys actually have a lot in common, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, that you're both actually Bush Fellowship awardees. I guess what would the word be, right? Fellows, there we go. But yeah, so you actually have a lot in common. It's really cool to actually have you both here to talk today. So we're actually going to take a little break. We're going to come back, and we're going to touch on a couple of current events that have happened recently. We like to do this a little bit at the beginning of the episode. So we're going to touch on some current events a little bit, and then we're going to get into our sort of our main conversation, get to know Rox a little bit more, and talk about the work that they do. Thanks for listening to the Beth Zemsky podcast, and we'll be right back. And welcome back to the Beth Zemsky podcast. So Beth, there were a couple of current events that we wanted to touch on right away.
Yeah, so, I was saying to Ryan and Rox during our little break that talking about this actually gives me a stomach ache. And I've spent, the last 30 years talking about power and oppression and how it operates. And I've really been thinking in the last few months of that. I talk about being a Jew all the time and have on the podcast, but I actually have probably talked about anti-Semitism. I can count the number of times I've talked about it on one hand, right? Which is an interesting thing for me to think about. What is that? And I know that one of the ways in which anti-Semitism operates for us as Jews is we don't want to call too much attention to ourselves. And so one of the ways anti-Semitism operates is, are you being too sensitive, right? And come on, that didn't really happen, which is part of how microaggressions and oppression operates.
It also sounds part of that sort of internalized dialogue that marginalized people.
Exactly. So I want to talk about the current series of things going on with Representative Ilhan Omar, who I voted for. I support, and in fact, I still have the lawn sign in my yard. It's picking up out of the snow. I've kept it there. And so this is kind of a complicated topic, and it's complicated because I think in general, we do, even those of us who are really skilled talking about power and oppression, we don't necessarily have a complicated, nuanced experience talking about anti-Semitism. And so the way in which anti-Semitic tropes come up in conversation are surprising. They're surprising to people who say them because we have not had it. Like, many of us who are white understand that there are microaggressions about racism. Not everybody understands that clearly, but can understand there are some things that are expressions of racism. We have much less experience talking about anti-Semitism, and I would say that's also in the Jewish community. We can feel it, but we don't always know, why did that bother us? What trope? Like, why was talking about George Soros so upsetting, right? Why is this thing about Benjamins like that Representative Omar said, what's so upsetting? Why is it so upsetting to say that we are potentially like being asked to make a loyalty pledge? Like, where does that come from, right? So even in the Jewish community, I think it's hard to put your finger on that. And all of those are deeply historical, anti-Semitic things that have actually been used to kill Jews. All of those things, right?
And now, Beth, you kind of educated me a little bit tonight. So I said, I think way back in episode 1 or 2, is that I'm not an expert in any of this at all. I just make podcasts, and I've been learning a lot from you as we go. You said that historically, that there has sort of been this sort of fabricated, manufactured divide between the Jewish community and other communities that we want to make sure to talk about tonight.
So I want to get to that, but I want to say something else about Representative Omar. So one of the things that's so complicated in the environment we're in polarization, is that we're not able to hold complexity in terms of the cultural competency. We don't hold complexity. So multiple things can be true at once, right? Did Representative Omar, I completely believe unintentionally, step in an anti-Semitic trope? Yes. Is she also being victimized as somebody who's Muslim and black? Yes. Right? All of that is true. And is she being scapegoated in a way in which other folks are not, who have said, in my mind, far worse things? Yes. All of that's true. What I wish for, and this is not just Representative Omar, but I'm also thinking about the governor, what's his name, Northrop in Virginia. So, and let me preface this by saying I was recently doing a workshop. That's the thing I get paid for. And I realized afterwards, partly because I got some feedback, that I did a microaggression in the workshop. And my first impulse was get defensive. Oh, come on, they didn't understand. And then I thought, wait a minute, I'm constantly saying, no matter what my intent was, no matter how much I work on racism, I did something that impacted people. So then how am I going to be responsible for that?
Which that defensiveness is it's a common response, right?
Of course it is. So here's what I wish, right? What I wish is, and let me also preface before I say what I wish, that when we were working on the same-sex marriage campaign, one of the things we learned about communication is that what actually impacted and shifted people's perspective were journey stories. So in other words, people saying, here's where I was, here's what I didn't understand, here's what I understand now, right? And so what I wish Representative Omar would do, and Governor Northrup, and they're very different, right? But to basically say, so for Representative Omar to basically say, I didn't understand the complexity of anti-Semitism, and frankly, why would she? Hardly any of us do. Here's what I've been learning. And it's hard because I keep stepping in it. Many of us keep stepping in it. And I'm learning this, and I'm committed to continue learning. Now, how are the rest of us going to take responsibility for when we step in things, and we are trying to do that with our allies and friends, knowing that even though we have oppressed identities, we're working in an intersectional movement. How do we stay in alliance with each other across these moments of complexity? And here's what I've learned, and I invite you all to keep learning, right? If I had a magic wand, boom, right? And to be able to say, you all need to learn this about Islamophobia, right? And so with Governor Northrup, for him to be able to say, look, I grew up in the South. I was a white guy in an atmosphere of racism. We all embed these stereotypes in our head. I did this blackface. It was wrong. It was bad. It's negative impact. Here's what I've learned. And for all the other white people in the South, I bet you've done these things. You need to be on this path of learning, and we all have to take responsibility, right? I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just being like pie in the sky, whether that would make a difference. But this idea that all we do is defend ourselves when we put our foot in it, it doesn't seem to me to be leadership. So,
if I had a magic wand, really, as these things happen, these terrible things happen all the time, and I really wish that that as bad as these things are, that more of us could see them as learning experiences, and that we could actually come out of them as a community, as a broader community, as a country, better for the experience.
And I think one of the complexities of this is to criticize Israel is not anti-Semitism. And part of what drives me crazy is the media keeps talking about what Representative Omar did as her comments about Israel. That's not the problem, right? I mean, in fact, not that I agree with Thomas Friedman about most things, but he had an article in today's New York Times where he actually did a really good takedown of Netanyahu and Netanyahu's racism and the human rights abuses in Israel and how and what's happening for some Palestinians, right? So he did a deeper criticism of Israel without getting into anti-Semitism, and that is. It's actually not that hard to do, but you have to know about how anti-Semitism operates to be able to actually criticize Israel, because there's lots to criticize. And part of what the challenge is we also don't understand AIPAC, this lobby that Representative Omar was talking about.
Yeah, I don't really know much about any of it.
It is, it's a very right wing, and everybody talks about it as being a Jewish lobby. It is actually equally, at this point, being used by the fundamentalist Christian right, who is actually now, American Jews are more critical of Israel at the moment than AIPAC is, and it's fundamentalist Christians who are really behind some of the Trump, and not that there's not fundamentalist Jews are too, but AIPAC is not just a Jewish organization. And so there's so many complexities going on here, right? And then they all get dumped on Representative Omar. And that's partly the intersectionality of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and racism. And the reason that I was interested in Rox being here tonight also is that one of the things that happens that we fall into all the time is that the right plays this plays this as person of color versus the Jews, which has been a long history of trying to split the alliance between Jews.
We have talked about this before, that they are playing the long game, right?
Yeah, and there's and it's been a long game of splitting Jews and African Americans. So I just said a big mouthful. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to say.
No, I mean, I think that you covered a lot of the feelings that I have, and I think it's about education and information. Right? People don't have access to the history, the knowledge. They don't know about the land. They don't have an understanding of what people are experiencing now and what they've experienced historically. And I think because people don't have any kind of understanding, it's not something that we're taught in school. We don't learn it in history class. The people have a lot of misinformation and defensiveness, and then division happens. I've seen this same kind of division in community work. The same kind of division happens within creating change, and it's about the same thing. It's because people don't really have an understanding of the histories and the stories that go with kind of the people.
Right, and so much of our understanding, I'm not, Israel, Palestine, Israel, and also anti-Semitism is mediated through an American media that doesn't want to deal with the complexities. It really doesn't, and really doesn't want to deal with the nuances between racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Israel and the United States, right? And so this is part of the reason that I'm so disappointed when something happens and we move straight into an us and them polarization rather than to try to say, look, multiple things can be true at once. Can we hold the complexity? Can we have open-hearted conversation? Because if we're not in relationship with each other, right? Like Rox and I have known each other forever, right? If we're not in relationship, when bad stuff happens, we have no resiliency, right? We can't go through those moments. Right, and that's part of what.
And those people on the other side know this.
They do, and they're counting on us turning on each other.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that what you're saying about like the polarization specifically between African Americans and Jewish folks. Again, I'm just going to bring it back to the land. We can see that in how land is divided right now. Like, where do interstates go through? Often through the middle of Jewish and Black communities, with the intentional divide on that. And so I think that when people can take like 5 steps back from their own fear and their own unwillingness to be vulnerable and have courageous conversations. That's what keeps this kind of game moving. And it is a game. It's about pitting individuals against each other.
Speaking of which, Rox, we actually saw each other at another event not too long ago. It was the They Them project at Lush. We both know a photographer, Brent Dundor, who does. It's basically a project about trans and non-binary visibility. And you said a few words at that event. And I believe you had talked about Minnesota Nice and how we're in Minnesota right now for anybody listening, and how it keeps us from having difficult conversations, those very conversations you're talking about.
Yeah, I think so. And it's about being willing to be vulnerable, and having a courageous conversation means that you have to be willing to kind of lay down your arms and listen when somebody tells you that you stepped on their toe. Like there's toe stepping happening, and you have to be like, how am I complicit in that? What am I doing? What is my learning curve, so I can have a real understanding of that, and then be willing to ask people conversational questions that sometimes it's hard, especially in a place like Minnesota. Nobody wants to talk about religion. Nobody wants to talk about marriage. Nobody wants to talk about money. Nobody wants, the sex. Those things are really, kind of hard, because then it makes you do something with the niceness of Minnesota, which is really just an unwillingness to say what you really think.
Which is a good thing that our weather is so challenging, because it gives us something to talk about.
That's right. Builds character too. Right?
That's so right. So right.
Yeah. So not to switch gears too much, but maybe we can talk about a place other than Minnesota for a second. So Rox, you were recently in Indiana. I understand both of you have been traveling a bit, but we wanted to make sure and talk about that.
Yeah, I got an opportunity to go to my hometown, where I went to high school, and present on a topic that also is, somewhat divisive. It's about our topic was prides and protest, and being real about the reason why we celebrate Pride in the first place, and moving from this place of scarcity and fear to be inclusive of entities like Black Lives Matter inside of Pride festivals.
Yeah, we were saying too, this isn't the biggest town in the world. They've never hosted the Super Bowl, right?
Oh no, it's a town. It's a town of 2,200. But their pride. The reason that the conference was there is because they won an award around being the best small town, big pride. And so there's 2,200 or so people that reside in the town, and over 3,000 come to the Pride parade and festival.
And Beth, you've actually been traveling a lot too, and wanted to make sure and talk about that.
Yeah, so I've just been on the road a lot working with clients in Boston and in Baltimore and New Jersey. And yeah.
We were talking, you've been on planes a lot and been in hotel rooms a lot and all that fun stuff, right?
Yeah, and then hurt my back snow shoveling, and so I feel a bit like a road warrior. The other thing is Phyllis and I did our Facilitating Cultural Change Part 1 in February, and we've got Part 2 coming up in May, and I'll talk about that a little later.
And so, Rox, we did talk a little bit at the beginning about you recently being awarded a Bush Fellowship. What can you tell people about that maybe don't know much about the program at all?
Every year, the Bush Foundation awards 24 leaders through a very grueling process. And those folks who are fortunate to make the cut get resources in the way of financial support to be able to build in their leadership. And that kind of evolution of that process is at a point now where people can kind of use the funds and the support to gain information either through a formal academic program or kind of a make your own. When Beth went through, it was a formal, you had to go to school process, right?
Yeah, and I did a self-directed thing, but I really had to fight for it. It's actually, my Bush Fellowship was about organizational development of social movement organizations, and it's where I got a chance to geek out on all the social movement theory. Without my Bush Fellowship, I wouldn't be the geek that I am today.
And Rox, when you say grueling, you're not kidding. You actually took a few cracks at this.
Yeah, I took a few cracks at it. Beth was very instrumental in mentoring me, giving me feedback, as well as Andrea Jenkins. And I think at one point, Andrea said, something to me like, I was like, I'm done. I'm sick of messing with them. I'm not doing it anymore. And Andrea was like, Rox, I have an MFA, and it took me more than one time, so you better get back in there and write again. And I think that was part of the process with Bush, is they want to kind of see if you are willing to go at it. And so my fellowship is about this creating an access point for an LGBT center to emerge in Minnesota. And my kind of stride with that is to ensure that LGBT space is really centering and core with trans and people of color.
I try to be pretty tuned in to sort of the broader community. And let me tell you, just from what I've seen, there's a lot of excitement. There is a lot of energy behind that. And everybody's pulling for you, hoping you can make this thing happen. How's that going so far?
Well, I think it's really good. Part of the trip to Spencer was with the Bush Fellowship, and it was really for me to see, how does this little town of 2,300 people sustain an LGBT community center? My recollection of the town is it was pretty not queer centric at all, and so to go and talk to their directors and talk to the young people that are part of that center and really kind of try to suss out what are the things that they're what are the cornerstone pieces? What are the things that they're building on to sustain this place? Because it's been in existence for a while.
Yeah. And I think the big question people are kind of wondering about in general is, where does the money for something like this kind of ultimately come from?
I mean, I think the money ultimately has to come from community. The sustainability mechanism has to come from community. We can't really rely on foundations or grant money in order to do that. And even if you do have support from foundations and grant money, they always want to know, what is the community investment? Because why would they want to invest a whole bunch of money and effort into something that the community is not even willing to support? So I think it's really about community having an understanding of the need and finding ways in which they can invest.
So one of the things I would really encourage listeners to do is go on Funders for LGBT Issues website and look at the tiny, itty bitty amount of funding foundations actually give to our community. I lost track of how much it is right now, but a year or two ago, it was less than 0.1%. Not 1%, but less than 1% of all foundation dollars actually go to the LGBT community. So we're significantly underfunded.
Less than 0.1%, right?
Right. And that was a couple of years ago. So I'd encourage folks to go on Funders for LGBT Issues website and look at where the funding is going. And some of it's going to like the large LGBT organizations like the LA LGBT Center or, stuff like that. But the amount of money that actually comes from foundations to the community is tiny. And then if you break it down to LGBT people of color or trans people, it's like almost non-existent, right? And so, I think that when we think about it has to be community, but I also think there's an advocacy role for all of us to be pushing foundations to see as they're working, and this is something I've been working on professionally, as they're working on the equity agenda, where are queer people in their equity analysis around where money's going, right? So check out Funders for LGBT Issues website and just take a look at where the dollars are.
And so, Rox, since we're talking magic wands tonight, if I could, what would the center look like to you? I mean, just in general. I mean, I'm sure you have some ideas about kind of some of the services you'd like to see there, and some of the community spaces that would be there. What would it look like to you?
I mean, I think, I have my own vision, and what I've seen from these community meetings, we've talked to over around 400 people, and what we're finding is a variety of desire. But mostly folks are saying that they want a mechanism for housing and resource referral. They want a place in which they can have gala type events, whether it be a wedding or a fundraiser for some other organization, a community kitchen. One young person said that they wanted to have a rooftop workout space with a pool that was an infinity pool that would run down the side of the building into a garden level pool. And I'm like, yeah, sure, why not? We
Sounds cool, right?
Right. And so, mostly what folks are wanting is access to health. And that looks like a place to work out and have fitness. That looks like having organizations that are trans and queer competent, be able to provide medical connections. It looks like having on-site housing and resource referral. And it looks like having a place to come together, fellowship, and having a social connection. And I'm trying to stack the bucket and the egg bucket for that infinity pool that runs down the side of the building.
Be the first one there doing cannonballs.
Given that we connected around a pool, I shouldn't have laughed, right? Right. No, I get it. So one of the things that's interesting about this also is that there's been a number of attempts to have a community center here. And there have been places, like some of what you talk about is actually what District 202 as a youth center used to do. It was a place for gala, it had housing referrals, it had a coffee bar.
MTHC provides a lot of the services that would probably be right.
Right, and you organized the exchange. And you had, Southside Cafe as part of that as a meeting space. So you've been trying to create space for a really long time.
Right.
And actually, this might not be a bad time. Do you want to talk about a couple of those spaces quickly?
Right now we're Rare Productions is at a space at 30th and Lake, and we're really trying to frame that on art and healing. So my partner is starting her healing practice, and she's doing sessions there. So if folks need some healing, connect with me, and I can connect you with her. And all those sessions are free. And then we're doing art. So we'll have an event this Sunday that's going to be a reading around secrets and lies. And we've done a few community figure drawing and people of color figure drawing and painting classes there.
And Rare Productions, just to catch people up a little bit, so they are primarily a live performance organization that focuses on like QPOC visibility. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, we do live performance, art and entertainment, and we also do. We also create space for artists to be able to present their work. And so, part of what Rare's been doing over the last 10 or so years is really kind of trying to provide that space and give platform and visibility to LGBT artists of color.
One of those platforms, if we could talk about just for a second, is the Power to the People stage at the Twin Cities Pride Festival, one of the biggest Pride festivals in the country, right?
Yeah, I think we boast something like 400,000 people. The Power to the People stage started 18 years ago, and it started really as this way to be inclusive. A person of color got kind of booted from a stage, and she was outraged, rightfully so. And she wanted the Minnesota Men of Color to help create a space inside the Pride Festival for folks of color to gather and have music and organizations that were culturally competent and in comparison to their communities.
And Beth, you said, which I didn't know, you said that there have actually been attempts in the past to create these sort of all-encompassing community spaces before, and it hasn't worked out, obviously, because we don't have one. What went wrong? Like, what do you think happened?
Well, there were a number of attempts. I mean, I think the one that was most serious was the city had a building. It was somewhere near where District was, in sort of, 18th and Nicollet or something like that. And there was the city had a building, and there was also at that point an HIV hospice that was maybe going to be in part of the building, so there was going to be housing, but it was really around HIV stuff. This was, back when. And then there was going to be the community center and some health stuff, and, I think it fell through around zoning stuff. And that was the most, and it was close. There was a lot going on, and it was close. And then the HIV organization had to open the hospice. And so they opened it in a different location without the community center. So there was a timing thing and a zoning thing, but it was, it got close. That was the closest we ever got. I don't know if you remember that or not. Did I represent it accurately, or was there other stuff?
And Rox, were you involved with this at all?
Well, I was involved with that because I worked at District 202 then, and I was right down the street. That space is now a meter farm, but yes, that conversation was pretty. I felt like people were like super excited and thrilled about it, and then it was about zoning and really kind of. Also kind of bringing organizations together to figure out how we can do this in a community partnership way, which is, sometimes difficult because we start kind of operating from a place of scarcity and fear. Oh, I'm not, if I'm in the building with y'all, then what does that do to my grant?
That's actually a big concern that I've heard from people too. Like, how do you make that work?
Yeah, well, other places do. So we could figure it out. So I want to pick up on the thread about art because part of the reason I wanted Rox on the podcast is we were talking to Creating Change about the super cool comic book you're working on with trans youth. And I was thinking about our conversation before about internalized oppression and how we don't take ourselves seriously and, don't sort of take up the full wonder of who we are. And I was just thinking about how incredible that these trans youth are creating superheroes.
And like I said, I try to be pretty tuned in to what's happening. I hadn't heard anything about this, so enlighten us, please.
So the Social Justice League is this idea that kind of came together by two different people at the same time. And so I was just kind of doing a workshop at a church, and I said something a little bit flippant, like trans people are awesome. We should have our own comic book series. And when I got done, one of the participants came up to me and said, my daughter is a senior at the U and is looking for a way to finish her senior art project, and just said to me the other day that she's tired of her trans friends being kind of pushed aside, and they were so awesome that they were just kind of like superheroes. And thought that maybe we should collaborate. And so we came together, and the artist is Sophie Fesser. And what we decided to do is create a comic book series that would showcase 12 local artists in 12 cities across the country. And those activists and leaders would be real life individuals who are trans and people of color doing superheroic things.
You base the characters on actual real people.
Yeah, they're real life individuals.
Who are superheroes.
Right. So in Minneapolis, for example, we have Andrea Jenkins and Philippe Cunningham.
So just the listeners know they're both trans-identified city council people, and Andrea is vice president of the city council this year?
Yes. Also a Bush Fellow. So that's those real life individuals. Their stories and what they're working on will be kind of created and illustrated. And so we're kind of in the second iteration of that project, and we have about 8 of the characters done from Minneapolis. Well, we hope to have the 12 characters from Minneapolis done by the end of this year. We want to take somewhat of a finished product to the Philly Trans Health Conference, where we can hopefully solicit more folks from across the country. So if you're listening somewhere outside of the Minneapolis area, and trans folks of color who are doing inspirational work in your area, connect and let's really figure out a way to literally draw out those people and get them into the comic book.
And so it sounds like a lot of the work is going to be volunteer based, but these things always take money, right?
They do. And so initially, the 12 folks in Minneapolis are all kind of letting us use their imagery. I think based on the test runs that we've done with this, it's going to be going like hotcakes. And so the goal would be that each individual character would get the proceeds from their book. Part of this process is also about, building equity for trans folks and not just kind of using their imagery. This has happened in our community a lot, where people just kind of snag pictures of Sylvia or other people and kind of use them without kind of putting back into community. So we want to make sure that each person who's participating as a character has a line of revenue. And I'm thinking, this will be each individual character will have a book, and then regionally there'll be a graphic novel. They can be bobbleheads and the whole 9 yards.
Beautiful. So you're actually going to eventually pay for this with the proceeds?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Of the merchandising and the marketing and all that. Right?
Correct.
Yeah, the challenge always is, and I always worry about this about you, is that then there's not money for your time as a trans activist.
Well, hopefully when we get all 144 characters, I will be developed as the Oracle.
Matrix reference.
Right, but I also think that, maybe we need to do another little GoFundMe or something for this.
Okay, I'm down with that.
And so along with this comic book, you've got a couple other big things happening.
Yeah, we're trying to build out Rare Productions in our new space. It's at 30th and Lake. And so we're in the very kind of beginnings of that process, talking to the city and really kind of flushing out what we want to do. Right now we're doing art and healing work in there. So this Sunday we'll have an event that's a poetry reading, and we've done some, figure drawing and painting classes. And the goal with this space is really to create an opportunity for artists to develop their work. And so if that means that they really just need some time on the turntables to figure out what their next set is, or if they need a place where they can bring a large canvas and work out on that canvas, we want to provide that actual mechanism of a building in order for artists to be able to create and manufacture their art.
And I just want to underline how important this is, right? Because we've talked in the podcast a lot about the stress we're living under, not just under the years of Trump, but just extend that.
The PTSD, right?
Yeah, the PTSD, persistent traumatic stress, and how important it is to have spaces for in this case, queer folks of color, but in general, places for cultural work, right?
For us to be in community, which is what we're talking.
And cultural work in a way that, we've talked on the podcast before about how much everything that's going on is sort of colonizing our imagination, and the way in which that could be really deadly for a community if we don't have spaces for creative imagination. And so when we think about spaces like what Rare is trying to do, which is provide space in community for people to have the support, to have a creative imagination that decolonizes it from the stress we're under, from the trauma, and the sort of systems of oppression that we're in, it's just super important for that to happen. And I'm always grateful to Rox and to Anna for creating that kind of space in our community.
Yeah, and I think as we look at like who gets access to space, it's really important, with the closing of intermedia arts and the ongoing thread about Heart of the Beast and other places in which artists can really invest their time and energy without having to pay really high overhead prices to keep their own spaces. I think it's really just important to remember that we can't do the work unless we have a place for creative outlet and healing.
And not just comic book creation, art in general costs money. That's just sort of the reality of it, right?
Well, sure, because there's a lot of overhead involved. Rent is not cheap, and as Minneapolis develops and redevelops land, it's who gets access to that is scarce, and so wherever I can, whatever organizations I'm involved with, I want to make sure that we can actually figure out ways to hold physical space so people can gather.
I was actually talking to some people recently too that there is a movement to make sure that this sort of unprecedented growth that we're experiencing as a city, that the benefit of that actually goes to the right people and not just one group of people.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things about the Twin Cities is that we have some of the biggest disparity rates in the country, right? And the disparity rates are twofold. I mean, it's not, one is that there's been this sort of structural racism around housing covenants, and so much of individual wealth is dependent on housing. And so much of the housing covenants and the racism of it has meant that folks of color in the Twin Cities are doing less well in terms of wealth because of the historic systemic stuff. And Rox was talking before about how highways, et cetera, have gone through communities of color and separated blacks and Jews, right? And so some of that was destroying wealth in the community. So some of the disparities exist because of that. And then also the white folks in Minnesota are doing better. So the gap is bigger, right? And so it's not just, as we think about growth now, making sure that communities of color and the folks who have been on the losing end of these things in the past aren't at now, but how do we really think about that in a reparations sort of way? Like, where really should the money be going? And how do we think about, as development happens, not gentrifying people out of neighborhoods? Because I'm working with a ton of affordable housing organizations right now, right? And part of the reason we have a crisis around affordable housing is that our occupancy rate is so low, and where the housing is available is not necessarily where communities are going to be in community with each other, right? And so the whole thing about space and where it gets constructed and can you keep it, I just thought I'd add another level of systemic analysis to the frustration you have.
Yeah, it's important because I think, we don't really think about the roots of why I can't get a thing. Why
you can't rent a space.
Right. It's not my credit, or it's not the fact that I can't afford it, but it's all those other things that go go into land use, and really who gets to be in a neighborhood, who gets to open a business. It's not a super easy thing to deal with the city. It's not a super easy thing to write a business plan. And so having those points of access, I think, is important. And I think it's also important to illuminate how to get that access for our community so that individuals who are entrepreneurial in spirit or whatever can also have that access point. And I think, I've been really lucky in Minneapolis. And I think one of the things that when I think about where do I want to live when I'm 70, and thinking about the snow, because we have to go back to the weather, there's this thing about the community of Minneapolis that's so rich that I don't ever want to lose that. And how do we ensure that kind of community connection and partnership and relationship building is authentic? And I think that I've been really lucky to have folks like Beth and others in my life who have been willing to just call me on my shit, for one thing, and also to be able to create a mechanism for resources so that I can actually analyze and have an understanding of what the next best step might be.
And it's all right now, all we can do every day is the next best thing, right? I mean, that's all we can do, and hopefully do it together.
Yes.
We're hugging.
For the podcast listeners at home, they're actually hugging right now. So, so Beth, as we wrap up, like I say, I'm learning about this stuff as I go too, and it sounded like we kind of started off this episode by framing this problem, by explaining it in a way that kind of said to me that kind of the big problem is that there are forces at work all the time, not just recently, but all the time, that are intentionally trying to divide the progressive community, the marginalized communities, various marginalized communities. And it to me, it sounds like, just listening to Rox talk and listening to your conversation, it really sounds like Rox is working on one of the things that is going to be one of the primary solutions. I mean, it seems to me like the solution to a lot of those problems is going to be being in community together and having those spaces and having those ways to be in community together. And it sounds like Rox is doing a lot of that work. So thank you, Rox, very much for the work you do and the work you've done that I'm sure I don't even know about. Maybe we can talk again sometime. So, but as we're wrapping up, Beth, is there anything else you wanted to say?
So part of what I love about the podcast is I get to have my friends on, and Rox is doing incredible stuff. And I also just want to do a shout out for folks. If you like this episode, I mean, I hardly ever do this, but listen to the other ones. They're on my website, bethsemsky.com.
The new website.
And, because some of my good buds who are doing this incredible community stuff, like whether it's Susan Raffo talking about healing justice, or Eleanor talking about narrative and framing, and now, wow, how, right? Or, Rebecca talking about graceful engagement in faith organizing. I mean, there's been some cool conversations about different ways people are doing this community stuff. But I think part of the reason I want to say that is that Rox is a super rock star, and we all can do a piece of this. Yeah. It's like, that's what I love about the superhero idea, is that, we're all regular people that are doing kind of amazing things to survive and thrive. And, sometimes we sort of talk about acts of courage. And I think every day is getting out of bed and deciding we're going to do something today to change the world is an act of courage, right? And so, so that's what I want to say, is just go for it.
Rox, to loop back around just briefly back to what you were saying about the center, that it's going to take community engagement, that it's not going to be like just one organization that's going to come and drop a bunch of money and say, here you go, that it's going to take community engagement to make something like that happen. But on another level, it takes that community engagement to make everything that we're doing possible. And it's going to continue to take that engagement from the community as well, right?
Yeah, I think you're right on that.
And that's a good place as any to wrap here. So we're going to go ahead and take a little break. We're going to come back. We're going to shamelessly plug a couple things, let everyone know what Beth and Rox are going to be up to here in the near future. Thanks for listening to the Beth Semsky podcast, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the Beth Zemsky podcast. Take a second here and wrap up and let everyone know what Beth and Rox are going to be up to here in the near future.
Well, it's Pride time almost, even though there's snow on the ground. And that's only a couple of months from Pride. So that means we're already way deep in. So if you want to perform, if you want to be part of what's going on at Power to the People, you can hit me up. Rare Productions is rareproductionsmpls.com. And all the work for the Minnesota Transgender Health Coalition can be found at mntransgenderhealth.org.
So a couple of things I want to shamelessly plug. The first is Phyllis Braxton and I, who's been on the podcast before, we're doing facilitating cultural change, sort of the one that is focusing on leadership for systems and social change, May 1st to 3rd in the Twin Cities. We limit it to 25 folks. We have a couple more slots left. So you can go on my website, bethzemsky.com, and go to workshops for info about that. Or you can go on facilitatingculturalchange.org and get info about that.
So I've actually thought about this. So the name of the conference could seem a little intimidating to some people. What kind of background do people generally have that attend?
People don't need to have a whole lot of background. You know, we do ask people to do some prep work. So there's some videos that I've now made to give people some background, whatever. But it's really for folks who want to think about how to think about intercultural competency and their own leadership skills to build intersectional movements for change, or to how to do intersectional organizational development, right? So it's like you can be in a community system or in an organizational system, and you want to. So the first workshop we did in February was about how to increase your skills as a facilitator. This workshop's about how to increase your skills as a change agent.
So you don't have to have a PhD or be a Bush Fellow to attend something or to benefit from it.
Right. We give you everything you need, right? Including incredible breakfasts and huge lunches every day. Because, you know, Phyllis is African-American from Mississippi and I'm Jewish from New York. And if we're not eating well, we are not having it, right? So we can't have a conversation unless we've got good food. So we'll have huge good food. The other thing is, and, you know, this is a little bit like to announce this, but I mentioned Rebecca Vocal, who was on a previous podcast. She just turned 50 yesterday. Barbara Satin, who's a trans activist in the Twin Cities, is turning 85 this summer, and I am turning 60 in June. And the three of us are having a birthday bash on May 30th. Nice. It's going to be at Dodge Nature Center. There will, and it's going to be a fundraiser for the National LGBTQ Task Force. Right. So folks will be coming from Washington. And so if you're on my email list, you'll get an invitation. But
I'm so there. That's so awesome.
So we're really thinking about this as sort of celebrating not just us, but the decades of activism that all of us have lived through. Certainly, you know, Barbara's 85 years and the changes she's seen as a trans person. And so anyway, be there. It's going to be way fun.
I can't wait for that.
All right, and with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this episode of the Beth Zemsky Pop. This is episode 12, I think, so we've been doing this for a minute now. So thank you very much for listening. Make sure to reach out to Beth via her brand new website, or you can find out more about what Rox is up to by going to the websites that they told you about. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening to the Beth Zemsky Podcast. The Beth Zemsky Podcast is a production of the nonprofit podcast community. Subscribe now on iTunes, on Android, or by email at bethzemskypodcast.com.